This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Thank you. I'll put this here. I'm thrilled to be here. I was told this was the energy seminar, and I pictured a seminar room. It's not quite a seminar room, but I hope that nonetheless we'll have a good discussion, and I should pay close attention to this clock so there's some time for you to ask me questions. So anyway, as you heard from Lee Johnson, I am not an energy scientist or an environmental scientist. I'm a political scientist with a background in peace and conflict studies. So I can't talk to you about the sciences of energy. What I can talk about is what I know, which is the geopolitics of energy. And in particular, I'd like to talk about the subtitle of my new book, Rising Power, Shrinking Planet. The subtitle is The New Geopolitics of Energy. So first of all, what is the... Can you hear me okay? Is this... No, there is no microphone. So can you hear me okay in the back? I'll try to project as well as I can. So first of all, what is the geopolitics of energy, and what is new about the geopolitics of energy? So by geopolitics of energy, I mean when states or when governments step in to manage the energy procurement of their country, if they're energy-consuming countries, when the governments manage the overseas procurement of energy, or if they're energy-supplying countries, the ones that produce oil and export it, when those governments manage the export of their energy supplies for certain political objectives, domestic or foreign. This behavior is sometimes called in the political science literature statism, and often has a negative connotation and is often applied to those bad guys like Venezuela and Russia and China and other countries that we don't particularly like their behavior. But statism, or state intervention in the energy behavior of countries, is practiced by all major countries, starting with the US of A and France and Britain and Japan. All of these countries have very extensive history of government intervention in energy politics, particularly overseas behavior of the government. So that's what I mean by geopolitics, and especially when military means are used for acquiring or protecting energy supplies. So there's nothing new about energy geopolitics. Probably the earliest instance of this was before World War I, when then First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, he had a long history, Winston Churchill did, in this business. When he was the head of the Royal Navy before World War I, was responsible for converting British warships from coal to oil propulsion, believing that would give the British Navy an advantage in World War I with the Germans, which he believed was inevitable. At that time, Britain did not have a supply of oil. The only oil supply under British ownership was in southwestern Persia, around the area of Abadan, and was controlled by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the progenitor of what we now know as BP, British Petroleum. And he persuaded the British cabinet to nationalize the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and to extend state protection over that to ensure that Britain would have a safe supply of oil in the event of World War I. And during the war and then after the war, Britain sought to extend its control over more and more territories in the Middle East to ensure that it would have an ample supply of petroleum. And this led to its pressure, its determination to gain control over the Ottoman provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul in the northern part of that area, and created the fictitious kingdom of Iraq in order to give the what became the Iraqi Petroleum Company centralized control under the British Empire, thus creating the nightmare that persists to this day, known as Iraq. There never was a country of Iraq until the British Empire created it for the purpose of extracting its oil. And so on and so forth. The other European empires and nations, and then the Russian Empire, later the Soviet Empire, behaved in a similar fashion. The United States didn't follow suit at this time because the United States at that time was the world's leading producer of oil. But during World War II, the United States used up so much of its oil, domestic supply of oil, that President Roosevelt became concerned that we would eventually run out of oil if we continued to pump it at the rate we did during World War II. The United States supplied 6 out of every 7 barrels of oil that were consumed by all of the Allied powers during World War II. So he made this a priority. And he understood, Roosevelt understood, that perhaps more than anything else, America's superiority in the ownership of oil was a critical factor in our success in World War II. And he knew that Japan and Germany lacked oil, and that was a decisive factor in their defeat. It was the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 when the Germans split their forces, attacking Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, and the Caucasus in the pursuit of the oil of the Caucasus that many people feel led to the ultimate defeat of the Germans. And it was the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, which now Indonesia, which the Japanese believed that the United States would retaliate by entering the war, that led them to attack Pearl Harbor, another catastrophic strategic error. So Roosevelt, probably more than any other leader up until that time, understood the significance of the geopolitics of energy, and he determined that the United States would have to have an alternate supply of oil to make up for the possibility that the U.S. itself would not be able to play the same role in future wars that it was able to do during World War II. And after an extensive search during the war, he and his advisors concluded that Saudi Arabia would have to play the role for the United States that Iran and Iraq played for the British Empire. And he concluded that we would have to form an imperial role with respect to Saudi Arabia. Bear in mind that as recently as 1942, the U.S. didn't even have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. But he met with King Abdulaziz, the founder of the modern Saudi state, in 1945 aboard the USS Quincy, and formed a military protectorate over Saudi Arabia, whereby the U.S. would protect the Saudi royal family in return for privileged American access to Saudi Arabian oil. And that is the basis upon which the United States has remained a dominant power in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf area, up until this day. And it is the alliance with the royal family that has led one American president after the other that says that we have to remain a military power in that region and to go to war if necessary to protect Saudi Arabia and to protect the flow of oil from Saudi Arabia to the rest of the world. This was made explicit in the Carter Doctrine of January 23, 1980, which says that the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf is a vital interest of the United States, and to protect this interest, we'll use any means necessary, including military force. And because the United States at that time did not possess the forces that were needed to play this role, President Carter created something called the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, which was then elevated in 1983 by President Reagan into the Central Command. Now, you keep hearing about the Central Command all the time because the Central Command has authority for all U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf area and in Central Asia and Iraq and Afghanistan. And just a few weeks ago, General Petraeus was made Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, and Senator McCain loves to talk about General Petraeus and the role that he plays in Central Command. But if you look at the charter, the original charter for Central Command, why it was created by Ronald Reagan in 1983, its principal strategic function is to keep the sea lanes open from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow body of water between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean, through which 1/4 of the world's oil passes every day. So when American leaders say that we don't go to war over oil, they don't know anything about the actual declared policy of the U.S. military and the role that the Central Command was created to fulfill. That's its original stated mission. And there's never been any question about that. And the Carter Doctrine and the Central Command, their entire history has been dedicated to this purpose of protecting the Saudi royal family and defending the flow of oil from that region. It was on this basis that Ronald Reagan authorized the reflagging of Kuwaiti oil tankers during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. It was on this basis that President Bush Sr. made the determination on August 3rd and 4th, 1990, that the United States would have to intervene in what became known as the First Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. And I believe that when that conflict ended on February 28th, 1991, with the decision to quarantine Iraq with the intention of producing regime change in Iraq, and that effort, that 11-year effort, 12-year effort, failed to achieve its intended result, that the current President Bush made the decision to continue the war, Operation Desert Storm, where it left off on February 28, 1991, with American troops poised on the border between Kuwait and Iraq to complete the ultimate intention, or the ultimate logic of eliminating Saddam Hussein through force. If you disagree with that proposition, we could talk about it. All of that, though, I believe flows from the Carter Doctrine of 1980. So the U.S. has long had a geopolitical position of using military force to protect the flow of oil. Originally focused on the Persian Gulf area, that principle has since been extended to the Caspian Sea area and to Africa, and I'll come to that. So to begin, geopolitics of energy is nothing new. So what's new, then, about the geopolitics of energy? That's kind of what I want to use the rest of my time to discuss. And why does it matter? Which is what you should be asking me. Well, there are some trends that are underway in the world today that I think are quite dramatically new, and that do have a significant impact on what's happening in the world today and will impact on our lives. And these involve, first of all, the diversification of the key players in the geopolitics of energy, a shift in the playing field. New areas have become significant, new areas have become important playing areas in the geopolitics, and new materials, not just oil. Up until now, oil has been pretty much the principal energy source that has dominated the geopolitics of energy. Now other materials, especially natural gas, have come to play a significant factor. So let me talk about these changes. For most of the 20th century, the geopolitics of energy was dominated by competition among a handful of major industrial powers: Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Russia / the USSR, the United States, and Japan. Most of what transpired in this field was the result of competition between these great powers for what existed of the world's supply of oil. And a lot of world history over the past 50 to 75 years was shaped by this competition, including key elements of World War II, as I indicated, like Japan's decision to invade the Dutch East Indies and to attack Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. In these struggles, the role of the energy supplying countries, they had very little to say about the outcome of the struggle. They were essentially passive players. Since the 1970s, however, the lineup of the key players in this contest has dramatically shifted, with new consuming nations, many of them from the developing world, joining the roster of key players, countries like China and India, for example, while many of the producing countries have themselves become key players as they've gained control over the production of their own resources. And these developments have great significance for us. By assuming ownership of their domestic energy resources, major producing countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela have gained significant influence not only over the price of oil, but also over the rate of production of their resources, and in some cases, the overseas allocation of where these supplies go. Although generally spurning the use of this power as a political weapon since the Arab oil embargo of 1973 to 74, they have sometimes acted in concert, usually through OPEC, to curtail supplies in order to raise prices, especially of oil, thus causing economic hardship in many oil-consuming nations. Some producers have also provided oil at concessionary rates to certain customers in order to gain political advantage. For example, Venezuela provides oil to Cuba at very low rates or on barter terms in order to advance its political agenda, a great deal of which is to form an anti-American political bloc in Latin America. The oil-producing countries also use their oil exports, in many cases, to finance the acquisition of weapons that they seek in order to enhance their military power. And this has consequences because many of these countries have a political agenda, as I've indicated, in opposition to that of the United States, for example. Venezuela is on an arms buying spree. Over the past few years, it has ordered $5 billion worth of weapons from Russia. Iran has purchased many weapons from Russia and China, and we consider this a threat to our security. One could think of many other examples of arms buying financed by oil that we would find contrary to our interests either strategically or on human rights grounds. Sudan, for example, buying weapons that it uses to suppress the rebellion in Darfur or to commit human rights abuses. So there are many ways in which the greater control over oil by the oil-producing countries and the use of that to raise the price of oil has political and geopolitical implications that alter the international environment in ways that were not true 30, 40, 50 years ago. Aside from this, the producing nations harbor a fundamentally different strategic interests than the consuming nations, including the United States. Their objective is to extract as much wealth from us for as long as possible, not to satisfy our immediate needs for an energy fix. Our objective is to get as much of their energy as we can at the lowest possible cost. This has led to a foreign policy dilemma, as reflected in the embarrassing, not to say humiliating, image of the President of the United States, almost on bended knees, begging the King of Saudi Arabia twice this year to increase output in order to lower world oil prices to benefit American consumers and boost his political image in the United States. This was twice this year he went to Saudi Arabia virtually to beg. He begged the King of Saudi Arabia to do this. And he was told to get lost in no uncertain terms. This reflects a different strategic interest. Our interest is for Saudi Arabia to pump more oil. And the more they pump, the lower the price of oil would be, and the more rapidly Saudi Arabia would exhaust its oil reserves. Of course, Bush isn't concerned about what happens after Saudi Arabia uses up all of its oil and its main source of wealth is gone. He's concerned about his term in office and maybe the next few years. The Saudi royal family understands that its future rests on the family's future rests on its ability to continue producing oil for as long as possible, because that's the source of its wealth and its ability to stay in power. It wants to keep producing oil for 50 years, for 75 years. That's a strategic clash. It's conceivable that this has also affected U.S. relations with Venezuela, because we have the same strategic clash with Hugo Chavez. He has made very clear his interest is not in satisfying our craving for more Venezuelan oil, but rather to produce Venezuelan oil at a measured pace and to use those revenues to benefit the Venezuelan people. And I believe that this clashes with America's, or at least Washington's, interpretation of our need to have in power a leader more amenable to our wishes that Venezuela pump more oil and sell it to us as much as possible. And I think this has led, I believe, to U.S. covert support for efforts to overthrow Chavez. An even more significant, more powerful expression of the shift in power from the energy consumers to the energy producers is the rise of Russia as an energy superpower. And of course, you hear a lot about that in the debates and in the campaign literature, especially of the McCain campaign, but also in comments from the White House. The fact that just 10 years ago, Russia was written off as a has-been former great power, now in the dustbin of history, and now suddenly, as a result of its wealth that it's garnered from its ability to sell large amounts of oil and natural gas to neighboring countries, has lifted its status in the world community. And it's not only because of its selling more oil and natural gas, but because Vladimir Putin, in his presidency, used the power of the state to re-centralize state control over the energy assets that had been privatized during the Yeltsin administration, and to give the state more strategic control over those assets, and to use them in a geopolitical fashion to exercise influence not only domestically, but also to intimidate neighboring countries like Ukraine and Belarus and Armenia and Georgia, to give Gazprom control over pipelines in those countries as well, so that Russia's energy power has been growing enormously under Putin's leadership and now under President Medvedev. And we all have come to see that Putin and Medvedev view energy as the basis upon which Russia will rise again as a great power, as a superpower, using energy rather than nuclear weapons as the instrument of intimidation and coercion of its neighbors. And the conflict in Georgia that occurred in August was directly related to this effort, in conflict with efforts by the United States to frustrate Russia's goals. The United States is playing the same game by seeking to build alternative pipeline routes through Georgia that would bypass Gazprom's natural gas pipelines. I'm jumping ahead because this is about natural gas rather than oil. But this is a way in which Russia uses its military might, its rising military might, to threaten Georgia, or rather to show the Europeans that it is capable of interdicting the pipelines that the Europeans seek to build through Georgia as an alternative to their current dependence on Gazprom's pipelines. So I could say much more about this, but in the interest of time, the point is that here is another producing state that is trying very hard to gain more and more control over the production and export of oil and natural gas, changing the rules of the international system. I was going to say a lot more about the rise of the new consuming powers in the pursuit of energy, but let me make this very brief so that we can have at least some time for your questions. But the most important point here is that it's no longer just the United States and the Europeans and Japan that are pursuing what's available of the world's supply of oil and natural gas and so on. But now we, the older, mature industrial powers, have to contend with increasingly determined, fierce competition from China in particular, but India following behind China, and then other developing countries which are going to need more and more energy in the years ahead. And we've seen that China can be an extremely aggressive, assertive competitor when it seeks to acquire energy for itself. China overtook Japan to become the world's #2 consumer of oil in 2003, and it's becoming increasingly dependent on imported oil because it now produces only half of the oil that it consumes. By 2030, it'll only produce about a third of the oil it consumes, about the same ratio as in the United States. And it must rely for the same suppliers as we rely on, mainly countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And so it must struggle with us for what's ever available. And there's a lot of question about whether those supplies will be adequate to meet the needs even of the older industrial countries, let alone to provide for the growing needs of the newly industrializing countries in the years beyond 2010 or 2015. So the competition can only grow increasingly fierce. And what makes this of geopolitical concern is that China is copying our behavior and forming military alliances with the countries upon which it relies. Just as we've forged these military alliances through the Carter Doctrine with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and now with Azerbaijan and other countries, so too is China forging military ties with its suppliers like Sudan, Iran, Uzbekistan, providing them with arms, military training, military services, in some cases competing with the United States for the loyalty of the same countries like Nigeria, where the US and China have been offering arms in a competitive fashion to try to break into the Nigerian oil supply market. And this can only create a self-sustaining kind of pattern where the inflow of arms will grow, creating greater instability in Africa, in the Persian Gulf area, and especially in Central Asia. Russia, too, in its efforts to gain control over the exports of the Caspian Sea area, is using military means of this sort, forming military alliances with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, under the auspices of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And Russia and China jointly work through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to build up military ties with the Central Asian states in efforts to drive the United States out of that area. So already these energy geopolitics have been militarized. They've acquired the character of a proto-Cold War-like atmosphere that we don't notice very much here in this country, but they certainly notice it in Russia, and they certainly notice it in China, and they certainly notice it in Central Asia and in Africa, and it's exceedingly dangerous. As my remarks have indicated, and I want to try to finish in a few minutes, these new geopolitics have placed new emphasis on areas of the world that were not part of the geopolitics of energy in the past. In the past, it was the Middle East that was the center, for the most part, of this competition. To some degree, the Caucasus, to some degree, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. But suddenly, Africa has become a major center of energy competition that has been militarized. And in recognition of this, we've passed through a new historical moment. I've spoken about the Central Command, which in my mind was a dramatic expansion of U.S. military power. If you think in Roman terms, when the Romans conquered a new area, they had a whole process of absorbing it into the Roman Empire and creating new provinces and appointing Roman consuls to govern those areas. And the appointment of a new Roman consul was the way in which the empire was expanded. And the closest analogy in the United States is the commanders-in-chief of these unified commands, the commander-in-chief of Central Command, who's really the proconsul, has more power than any American ambassador, commander-in-chief of Central Command, whose power extends from Egypt in the west to Afghanistan and the Central Asian republics in the east. We created a new proconsul 1 week ago, the first time in 24 years. Africa Command was activated on October 1st. We have a new proconsul for Africa, the first time in our history. This is a dramatic change dramatic expansion of American military power and reflects, I believe, a recognition in Washington that we are becoming increasingly dependent on Africa's energy resources and that we are competing with China for control over those resources, and that we need a more elaborate military capacity, command capacity, to ensure our success in this competition. We don't know how many of you were aware that we passed a new imperial milestone last week. It was certainly noted in the African press, if not in the local press. The rest of the world noticed that. We just are not aware of it. That's how blind we are. Some of you may have noticed it. So there are new areas of the world that are the focus of this competition. The other one, of course, is the Caspian Sea basin, where we had a significant, dangerous clash on August 7th and 8th, where another American protectorate, the Republic of Georgia, clashed with Russia. This was not, just a fluke. The U.S. has been grooming Georgia from before Saakashvili's days, when it was ruled by Edward Shevardnadze, to be an energy corridor under American sponsorship to bypass Russia, and has been the beneficiary of more U.S. aid than any other country in the former Soviet Union. Well, I could say a lot more about that. There's an intense geopolitical competition underway between the U.S., China, and Russia for dominance of the Caspian Sea region. There, the focus is on natural gas more than oil, and this speaks to the other point I was making about the rising importance of resources other than oil. Much more to be said about that, but I'll just highlight the fact that as oil becomes less plentiful, which will happen starting, many people predict, beginning in 2012, whether it's 2010, 2011, 2012, 2015, but we're probably reaching the moment at which oil supplies will not rise further from where they are today. Conventional oil, there'll be tar sand oil, there'll be synthetic oil, there'll be deep water oil, but conventional oil will not rise and will become more dependent on natural gas, especially the Europeans. People in Asia will become more reliant on natural gas. And then the focus will be very heavily on Russia, on the Central Asian republics of Turkmenistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, on Iran and Qatar, because those countries together have about 50% of what remains of the world's natural gas. So very heavy focus on that part of the world. Much more to be said about that. I'll just throw that out. So finally, why does all of this matter to us? Why does this new geopolitics matter? It matters because, as I've hinted, there's a momentum developing to all of this that will affect our lives if we don't pay closer attention to it. Just to give you one example of what I'm talking about, John McCain's, among his major foreign policy objectives, is to fast track, but I heard Obama say the same thing last night. So I once thought there were a difference there, but now both of them are saying to fast track Georgia into NATO. If Georgia becomes a member of NATO, and McCain also said Ukraine too, and he said both of them are corridors for energy transportation. This means that there will be a NATO obligation to defend those countries in the event of a clash with Russia. Well, my friends, I don't see Europeans supplying large armies to defend those energy corridors. It's going to be you young people in this room who are going to be put into uniform and sent to those places to defend those energy corridors, not the Europeans. Who else is going to do it? We're talking about a massive expansion of American military responsibilities to defend these new strategic interests in Africa and the Caspian Sea area on a scale proportionate to what we've already committed in the Middle East. That is the natural conclusion of this trajectory of greater geopolitical dependence on the energy of these areas if these policies continue to follow through. The cost of this will be unbelievable. The new defense budget adopted by the Bush administration and released in February calls for the highest defense budget since World War II in real terms. And it's not including the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the mainline defense budget, $515 billion for fiscal year 2009. And if you read the small print, they're not talking about fighting Islamic militants in the Kasbahs or whatever of the Middle East. You don't need $515 billion to do that. You just need a lot of Army and Marine troops on the ground. You don't need aircraft carriers at a cost of billions of dollars each and new long-range bombers. What do they need them for? They say we need them to fight resource wars with China in 2025 to 2050, when China is going to have, they say, a world-class navy to compete with us to gain access to the resources of Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia. That is what the Pentagon says we need this vast increase in military spending for. And if we go down that path, I can tell you there will be no money whatsoever to go ahead with the plans that Barack Obama and John McCain say they favor for energy alternative developments and renewable energy and the fine projects that are underway in this campus for averting global warming, because we will be spending every dime of taxpayer dollars to prepare for the future energy wars and resource wars with China. That's why the new geopolitics of energy matters to you. And so I say that we all have a very strong vested interest in examining these policies closely and in contesting them and in criticizing them when they appear dangerous and threatening to our well-being. I support the people of Georgia, and I support their development, and their peaceful and democratic development. But I think the notion of rushing them into NATO and then defending them with a large increase in U.S. military spending and sending troops there and confronting Russia in a pre-World War III kind of scenario is an insane, dangerous, self-destructive path. And we have to start talking about that. I think the idea of starting a new Cold War and an arms race with China over the energy of Africa is the most insane idea on earth. We have to develop alternative scenarios. That's what I believe. So I'll stop right there. I'm sorry I went on longer than I intended, and I want at least we have some time for you to challenge me. Thanks. Okay. You're first, you're second, you're third.
How much power do you think Russia really has with its natural gas sword, if you will, for political purposes, like it's wielded with the Czech Republic recently, considering it cuts both ways? They deprive the target country of natural gas and heat and other power, but they also deprive themselves of export income.
Yes, that's true. But Russia has 1/4 of the world's natural gas. And all the other schemes for Europe to find substitutes are extremely problematic. So Europe is dependent on Russian natural gas. And so for them to defy Russia is extremely problematic for them. And also the one route that the Europeans favor, the Nabucco pipeline, goes through Georgia. And I think the Russians are saying with their move and by keeping their forces in South Ossetia, which is, I don't know, a dozen or so miles from this pipeline route, if you threaten us in any extreme way, we could cut that pipeline anytime we want. So, I think Europe is going to remain in a dependent status. You were next.
Okay, two quick ones. One, could you put a dollar amount per barrel of oil that we import from the Middle East based on the military subsidy? And then the second one is, how would the growth of tar sand development affect the playing field?
I'll be very quick. The increase in tar sands, which probably will not occur now, because if given the economic situation, because it's so costly to develop, but even if it does, it'll have a negligible effect because Canada's conventional oil is in decline. So it'll probably replace the lost conventional oil. My estimate is that we spend about $150 billion a year on protecting Middle Eastern oil, not counting the war in Iraq. If you count the war in Iraq, that's probably double the cost in hidden taxes of what we pay for oil. I'd recognize this gentleman and then Paul, and then you'll be next. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned,
Were you waving at me? You'll be after that.
The whole era of oil geopolitics, and you could take it back into coal and wood before that.
Yes, before that.
Has been nightmare after nightmare after nightmare. And I was wondering if you see a strategy for possibly deconstructing that as new solar storage technologies come up, or are the vested interests in oil and military so strong that you could never break through that?
Well, I think we have a chance for the first time in a very long time now, because the public concern on this issue is so great. Now, last night you heard the debate, and rough order of magnitude, they devoted about a third of their time to energy. And I think that's because they're hearing from focus groups and from polling data that the public is totally aroused. And I travel around the country speaking to groups like this. I've been probably in half the states in the past 6 months. And wherever I go, people are completely agitated and aroused about this issue, and they want to change America's behavior. So for the first time ever, there's a very high, intense public demand for change. So public leaders are going to have to make changes, or they will be replaced by people who don't. What there isn't is agreement on what the way is to do that. Around that, there's disagreement. Some people think it's nuclear power. Other people think it's solar power and wind power. And on that, we're going to have an intense public discussion until we reach consensus. Paul, you're next.
Yeah, just on what you just said, one of the big problems, of course, is the time course that will be required to make a shift. We're not going to be getting most of our energy from wind or solar or anywhere else, nuclear, for 30 or so years, which we've got to face this situation. But the question I wanted to ask you as a political scientist is, I've watched this force structure change now over 10, 15, 20 years. I've seen talk of using nuclear weapons to get al-Qaeda, for Christ's sake. What do you think the chances are of getting through this period in a highly nuclearized world, particularly if you get somebody like McCain as president who seems to like bombing? In other words, are we going to, as we get our forces stretched thinner and thinner, and they're already stretched incredibly thinly, the temptation to use nuclear threats is, I think, going to get larger and larger. Yeah. But you're a political scientist, you can give me the answer.
Yeah, but I think what we need here is an economist to tell us how deep the economic crisis is going to be, how long it's going to last, because I think it will suppress energy demand. And the question is, will it extend to China and India? Because up until a few months ago, all the projections showed an intense increase in energy demand from China, competing with the United States for more and more energy. And that was the spark, that would be the spark for all of this. Now, if the Chinese economy slows down and the US economy slows down and energy demand in both reduces, then some of this pressure will disappear, at least for the time being. There'll be terrible pain for everybody, terrible pain. People will suffer. People will not be able to heat their homes. I live in New England, where they're predicting terrible pain this winter, that people will freeze to death, literally freeze to death, and in the Midwest, because they can't afford to pay for home heating oil. That's what's going to happen. But that might abate the risk of a catastrophic war over energy for the time being. So I don't know, just for the time being. I think that if prices go down. If prices rise, that might be a good thing too, because then the pressure for people to switch their behavior will increase. And there's also been signs of that. So we'll have to see. I don't think it's going to come to, I don't think the worst is going to happen. What I fear more is an atmosphere, a poisonous atmosphere, a Cold War-like atmosphere that justifies spending on ridiculously expensive warships and planes, that draws money away from investment in energy alternatives, more than I do an actual nuclear holocaust. I had recognized this person, and then you. Yeah, and then I'll come, I'm sorry, I'll try to be, go.
My question is, you were talking about Bush going and speaking to the leader of Saudi Arabia about, begging him to potentially pump more oil on the market to decrease oil prices. But my question is, why wouldn't Saudi Arabia do that? Because it seems they want a pretty narrow zone. They want oil prices at a certain amount where they can get a handsome profit, but if it gets too high, then we begin looking, as it seems Americans are doing, for viable alternatives to oil. So do you think it's because Saudi Arabia does not have the excess capacity to pump more oil?
I think there is that. I think it's partly that. I think probably it had something to do with that they're not telling us the truth about their actual ability to pump more oil. That's half the story. The other half the story is they have one of the highest birth rates in the world. And they have such a huge population that it's essentially a kind of a welfare state where they need more and more money to somehow subsidize the lifestyle of this growing population. And if they don't, they're going to face internal unrest and disequilibrium. So they're caught in a bind. Yes, you're next, and then you.
So you're really critical of American policy, but we do need to secure an energy supply in the economy. So what do you think is the alternative, a better way to do that?
Well, I would say, a quarter of the energy that we're procuring is waste. It's for selfishness, for selfish purposes. So people could drive big cars that serve no useful economic purpose. So I'm in favor of incentives for people to avoid waste or tax them for their selfishness. Now, I could elaborate on that, but in China, you're taxed on the basis, when you buy a car, on the basis of the fuel efficiency of your vehicle. If you buy a very fuel efficient car, you pay no tax or very low tax. If you buy a gas guzzler, you pay a much bigger tax. Now, if you're wealthy and you could afford to buy a giant SUV and you're willing to pay that high tax, okay, so be it. But I think you should pay for the privilege of wasting oil and putting American soldiers at risk to defend it for yourself, because it's selfish behavior. Yes?
I appreciate the benefits of rhetorical flourishes, but I was wondering if you could acknowledge that there's no chance that Georgia will come into NATO, since it requires unanimous consent of all member countries, and most of the other NATO members have explicitly said they're going to veto membership, and also that the locus of the problem in oil doesn't exclusively rely on the United States. It's as much Georgia playing the US off Russia, Kazakhstan playing Russia off China and the United States, and so these relationships are a little bit more complex than some of the rhetoric you put out.
Thank you. Am I supposed to respond?
I was just wondering if you'd acknowledge those 2 points.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it's absolutely true that a lot of the European countries are awfully nervous, but that was a policy objective that was expressed. And at the last NATO meeting, when George Bush asked for fast-track NATO membership for Georgia, the other countries said, no, not right away, but certainly we'll give them consideration in the not too distant future. So it's not like they're saying no, they're saying not right away. And both Obama and McCain said we're going to make it a priority to try to move this along. So I don't think that I spoke out of line exactly with the political environment as it stands today. I think you're probably right that a lot of Europeans have deep misgivings about this, but you know, if they got a full court press from the President of the United States, you know, they may at least start the process along towards full membership. Certainly, I didn't say anything about Kazakhstan. I think you're absolutely right, and in my new book, I talk at great length about how China, Russia, and the United States all try to woo Kazakhstan and how Kazakhstan plays them all against each other. What I think happened in Georgia is that you have the two halves of the bipolar U.S. government speaking to different ears. You have the realists speaking in one ear. Condoleezza Rice was there in July saying, don't rise to the provocations from Russia, keep your cool. To Mikhail Saakashvili, keep your cool, don't rise to the provocations, don't do anything crazy. And I think John McCain and Dick Cheney's office are saying, yeah, stand up to the bastard, show him who's boss. You know, we'll support you. And I think he heard one and not the other. And I truly believe that he went into South Ossetia on August 7th thinking that American jets were going to come overhead and support him. But yes, it's much more complex than my rhetorical flourishes indicated, and I entirely accept that comment. I recognize...
We're out of time. Some people have to go on to the next class.
I understand.
So could we all thank Michael Klare?
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.